So tonight we're looking at secular humanism, and this is kind of a two-parter. this study. There's a lot to talk about when it comes to humanism. So let me just talk about what secular humanism is to start with. And secular humanism, if you sum up in one phrase, it would be that man is the measure of all things. That's sort of the phrase you would use for it. And it doesn't mean that it's focused on human beings necessarily, but man is the measure of all things. In other words, everything is based on human values. That's what it's talking about. That's what humanism really is. So in other words, we don't concern ourselves, if we're a secular humanist, with what God says, but more on what man thinks. That's where the focus is, on what man thinks instead. And some common branches of secular humanism are atheism, agnosticism, existentialism, and Marxism come to mind. There's some other isms out there too, I'm sure we could throw in this category. And so let's talk about how we got here. How did this whole thing of secular humanism get started down through the ages? Back in the 1400s, the Gutenberg printing press was invented, and that was just a radical invention at the time. The movable type and be able to reproduce books rapidly rather than hand copying a book. And as a result of that, they started printing up these ancient writings that were available, and they started printing up these ancient Greek and Roman writings. And that's credited actually with sparking sort of the Renaissance, as people were reading this ancient literature and they're all into this ancient Greek and Roman time to print up Bibles. And that's, credited in part for sparking the Reformation. Maybe you've seen a Gutenberg Bible. I remember when I was in college, they had a Gutenberg Bible that came into town. It was at the university, and I wasn't saved at the time, so I'm like, well, what is that? I've never heard of that before. What is that even talking about? But anyways, back to the Renaissance. The Renaissance took place from about 1400 to 1600, and Renaissance, the word Renaissance means rebirth. And Renaissance is seen as really a rebirth of man's sense of independence and individualism. And in this time is when the development of the empirical sciences really begins. Men like Galileo and Kepler and Copernicus were famed people of the time of the Renaissance. And these men, I will point out too, most of them anyways, all believed in the Bible. So just because they were scientists didn't mean they weren't Christians. And that's something that's different from, unfortunately, a lot of what we see today, where there's not always a combination there, where there's a separation. But they developed the idea of empirical science. That is, that we use experimentation and observation to understand what we see around us, to understand scientific laws and so forth. We call that today the scientific method, right? That's the terminology we use for that. These men, because they had studied the Bible, because they knew God was a God of order, they were looking for His order in the universe around them. And so they were looking for, how does this work? Because we know God would set it up in a way that makes sense. It's not just random and chaos out there. God's a God of order. What He created is going to have order as well. And of course it does. Tragically, the day wasn't keeping in step with these scientists. In fact, the church of the day was rejecting this new science. And many believe it was at the coaxing of the universities of the day, maybe not surprisingly, because the universities of the day, they were threatened by the likes of Galileo, because the universities, what they taught in their schools, was all based on the Greek methods of assumption and extrapolation. That's the science that they knew. That's the science they were teaching. And so they felt threatened by this new science that Galileo and others were coming up with. And maybe you've, in your schooling days, maybe you studied a little bit about some of the ancient Greek science and Roman science, that sort of thing, men like Aristotle. And it always amazed me that they would, under these methods of assumption and extrapolation, that they would think about, how something might work, and they'd come up with all the reasons how something might work, but never do an experiment to see, does it work that way? They'd never actually, do the test. To us it's so basic now, because we've lived lived in the era of the scientific method, all of our lives. And so we're just thinking, well, yeah, of course you would just see, does it actually work out? But they wouldn't do that. They just sort of pontificate about it. And so due to, what was perceived as contradictions with the Bible at that time, for example, thinking is the sun at the center of the universe, or is the earth at the center of the universe, or galaxy, I should say. Because of that, they, had this reaction to Galileo and all this at the encouragement of really the universities that were threatened by this new science, because it didn't fit with what they were teaching. And this created this division and this rift that we still feel today, that many believe is a real rift, but really shouldn't be. And that is between reason and faith, right? That there's a separation between reason and faith, that these are two separate sources of knowledge, was the argument. To the point that you find, another man who's famous from this generation, Descartes, who said, "I think, therefore I am." Right? We've all heard that expression, "I think, therefore I am." In other words, the foundation of certainty for us has shifted from God to man. I think, therefore I am, right? It's not because God says, and I am. It's because I think. That's why I am. Then we come to the Enlightenment, which is from 1600 to 1800. And in the Enlightenment is when a lot of the scientific laws then were really discovered. This is the time period of men like, Sir Isaac Newton, Bacon, and Boyle. And as a result of that, all these scientific laws that were being discovered, like gravity and all these things that we still use today, obviously they are laws of science, it caused this reaction by the general populace. Now, Newton, for example, was a Christian himself, so he didn't think this way. But people in general started thinking that, well, the universe is just kind of this machine. It's got all these laws that are running it, and so we don't need God anymore. We don't need God to keep it going. Because before that, that's what people would look to. They'd think, well, God is the one who's doing all these things and keeping the universe humming along. But because of the discovery of these scientific laws, they thought, well, we don't need God. Things just work this way because they just work this way. This is how it was set up. It doesn't need God to sustain it. And you had philosophers like David Hume even challenging the legitimacy of the Bible openly, which is pretty shocking if you think about how long ago this was, and encouraging people to think differently and even theorize that, the ultimate stuff of the universe is just matter. It's all just physical. There's nothing else to the universe, just the physical material. There's nothing more. And so then, in this brief history lesson, we come to the modern age, right? We come to the modern ages, so starting in 1800, and you might recall that in 1859, Charles Darwin's Origin of Species was published. It's his theory of evolution. And with the theory of evolution, then, it removes the remaining need for God. If they already had thought, well, maybe we don't need God to keep things going. Well, with evolution, we don't need God to start things either. We can explain it all now. Creation can be explained naturally. There's no God necessary here. We can look to ourselves then for all the answers. We don't need to look to God. You think about it, evolution says we even created ourselves, right? That's the audacity of evolution. And so we're looking at secular humanism. This is a prevalent worldview today. Multiple polls average out to about 20% of the world's population are secular humanists today. And so what are their core beliefs of a secular humanist? First of all is the denial of God's existence. And really anything supernatural. It's this idea of naturalism, that everything can be explained through natural processes and phenomena. There's nothing divine necessary in their view. They would argue that, man has made God in his image, not the other way around. We know that the Bible says, and it's true, that God made us in his image, but they say, no, it's the other way around is what happened. So since they deny God's existence, they also deny miracles. It's just an extension of denying God. They deny that miracles can take place. You even have groups like the Jesus Seminar, which you don't hear as much about these days as we did maybe like a decade ago, but it's a group of supposed Christians, but they even deny the resurrection of Christ. if you've watched PBS very much, you've seen Jesus Seminar. They're usually on there. Unfortunately, they don't always have a good representation of Christianity on that particular channel. The next thing is that they teach that evolution is a fact, or they believe that evolution is a fact. The existence of the universe, all the complexity we see all around us in the universe, they believe can be explained through natural processes, a lot of time, and random events. That's all you need. It's kind of those three ingredients: natural processes, time, and random events. And when we look at things like our personalities and our minds, that we think, how God, recognize how God crafted us in certain ways. He made us uniquely, the Bible says. Well, they say, no, that's just a simple result of chemical and biological reactions going on in your body. There's no real designer behind, these personalities we have, and so forth. They believe in the potential of humanity, that human beings are self-sufficient, or can be. And so religion is not necessary. Religion is, the opiate of the masses, as Karl Marx famously said. Religion, comforts the weak, but really has no real answers, they would say. Humans are not free until they break away from religious chains, in their view, and start to look to ourselves as human beings to solve our problems through reason and science, instead of looking to God for answers. And it's kind of an optimistic view, like we can do it, we just need us, we've got this sort of thing. I remember an atheist friend of mine in school talking about how he thought that, anytime you get a bunch of people together, right things are going to come out of that. That's what's going to happen. If you get enough people together to talk about a problem, the right answers are always going to come out, which, sometimes good things come out, but there's that thing called the sinful nature. And so sometimes terrible things come out, so it's not a guarantee that just because you get people together, good things are going to happen. They also believe then in the centrality of science. Science is the only source of truth. They really quote it like dogma. They speak of evolution and stuff. That you can tell that is their religion, really, is science, is what they really put their faith in. But faith, they would say, is summarily rejected as inconsistent with science, although they're really putting their faith in science, even though they may not want to admit that. They believe in relativism, moral relativism, that there are no moral absolutes, that there are no God-given, rules that we need to live by, no morals that came from God, that man decides all on their own. It's all just cultural. Each society decides what the rules are going to be for them. Within that, they believe man is essentially good, and man's going to try and do the right thing. And so what we really need in this picture for us to improve is not religious transformation, but education. We just need to be educated, and that's how people will improve themselves and society improves. Now, interestingly, secular humanists don't always agree necessarily on every one of these points, but they all agree that there are no moral absolutes. That one they all agree with. They all like that one, and we as Christians know why, because they want to be able to live however they want to live, So it's great to say there's no ultimate standard that God has set, even though there is, in fact, an ultimate standard God has set. They also believe then in the finality of death, that there is no spiritual, nothing immaterial to existence. It's all just matter. Remember, that's what they said. And so once someone's dead, that's it, There's nothing, they don't exist anymore in their opinion. And so what are some ways to share with someone who is of this background, who's someone who is a secular humanist? First of all, we can look at the denial of God's existence and anything supernatural. We can try and address that. First of all, hopefully we can get our friend to admit that, that's a dogmatic statement to say that God doesn't exist. Right? You're making a pronouncement when you say God does not exist. That is not something that can be proven through the scientific method, which is what they will say. They want they'll only trust what can be proven through the scientific method. That means that you can have a hypothesis, you can reproduce it through experiments, all that sort of thing. That's what they're putting all their faith in, but you can't do an experiment to prove there is or is not God, right? That doesn't really fit with that. That doesn't fit for that line of reasoning. You can't use that. The only way that you could say that there is no God is if you had all knowledge, right? If you are God, that's the only way you could say that. If you're omniscient, is the only way you could say that nowhere in the universe is there a God. It's the only way you can make that statement. So they can't really make that dogmatic statement. All they can say is, well, I don't think there's a God, or I've never met this God, but they can't say there is no God. Secondly, when it comes to this idea of if there's a God, we can challenge them, with Pascal's wager. Blaise Pascal lived from 1623 to 1662, and he was a French mathematician. And he said that, reason alone can't prove the existence of God and immortality. And therefore, when it comes to the question of God, we have to make a wager. We have to place a bet, as it were, on this whole concept. We either can bet on God, that's the first option. We can accept, the Lord Jesus as our Savior. We can accept that He is real. And Pascal says that, if you're right, you're going to win everything if you're right about this, because you're going to live a good life now. As a moral person, as a Christian, you're going to live a good life now, and then eternally you're going to be in heaven. And he said that if you're wrong, you really don't lose anything if you're wrong, because you're still going to have a good life now. And, the statistics bear this out, what he suggested, that those who live moral lives, those who have conservative principles and so forth, they actually have happier lives. In surveys that have been done over and over again, they come out with much happier lives than those who are progressive, the hedonist, the liberal, point of view of how they're going to approach life and really live in a godless way. They don't end up as happy as those who believe in God. And so he said, if you're wrong, you don't lose anything. And he was right. You have a good life now. You're going to be happier now. And then if you die and there was no God, well, you didn't lose anything. You just had a good life, and that was it. But it turns out if you bet that there is no God, if you reject the Lord Jesus, that if you're right, well, you don't win anything. You didn't have a better life here. You're not going to be as happy, the polls tell us, in your life here. And then if you're wrong, which, we know as Christians that you are wrong because there is a God, well, you lose everything eternally. You lose everything. And you have nothing but an eternity of regret. And so Pascal's conclusion here is you never lose betting on God, and you never win rejecting Him, is what it comes down to. But let's look a little more at some arguments for the existence of God here. And that's really kind of the focus of tonight's study. The next line of argumentation is, where did we get the laws of logic from? What is the origin of logic? The laws of logic are these, and we talked about this in our last study, I believe, too. There are these three logical laws that really are the basis for really all, human reasoning. And we depend on these all the time. The first law is the law of identity, and it says that the way logicians will phrase it is A is A. In other words, something is what it is. So I am a person. That stays true no matter where I go. I am still a person. The law of identity holds true. I will always be a person. The law of non-contradiction, the second law, says that two things that are opposite are not the same thing. So either I am a person or I'm not a person, but those are two different things. I can be a person or not a person, but they're opposite of each other, and we clearly see that. There's no overlap between them, which leads to the next point, the next law, and that is the excluded middle. That either something is A or non-A is how they phrase it. So either I am a person or I'm not a person, right? And these are kind of basic logic that we all understand and that we use all the time. Well, where did that law come from, right? Where did those laws come from? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense that when we just had chaos, running rampant in the universe, that somehow out of all that, these three logical laws appear. These laws are independent of people. They would exist whether we did or not. They don't fall apart whether there are people on the scene. No, we just discovered them, really. And they're eternal. They're immaterial also. They're eternal and immaterial, aren't they? Nothing's going to take those away. This is actually a good argument then for God's existence. The laws of logic themselves are an example of something immaterial and eternal, just like God is immaterial and eternal. He's a spirit. He doesn't have a physical body. And just like the laws of logic here. And whenever there's a law, there's always a lawgiver. Well, the lawgiver of the laws of logic, who could create these eternal, immaterial laws? Well, only God could have done that. God created these laws. God also gave us moral law. Morality is not something that's defined by an individual society. We find that morality actually transcends societies. It means that all societies have the same morals. That's why any society you look at, they all are going to have laws about violent crime as an example. Now, there can be some differences, there can be some minor differences there, but all of them, for example, are going to recognize that murder is a moral wrong. You're going to find that in any culture. You put you anywhere on the globe, you're going to find that same thing. It doesn't matter. Even if they've never even seen someone from your part of the world or not, they're going to believe that murder is wrong as they define it. And so we have, this experience that these laws transcend societies, and morality differs from the laws of a society, or like from the laws of, say, like our state or something like that. It's different in how we respond to it, because morality brings it with a sense of oughtness, is what apologists say, and that oughtness is that we feel like we ought to obey it. That's what they're talking about. There's just an oughtness to it. Like you realize this is the right thing to do. This is what I should do. Or maybe this is what I should not do. In the case, as the case may be. But when you go out and are out in society and you see some of the things going on around us, you read the newspaper, it's clear that not everyone has an oughtness about all the laws, of a state and so forth. Just get out on the highway and someone who's a perfectly law-abiding person goes flying by you at 90 miles an hour, because they don't feel an oughtness about obeying the traffic laws necessarily. But when it comes to these moral issues like this, we have a nagging inside about it. If we transcend those laws, we have a nagging inside of us about it. We know we ought to do. When we fail, it's likely going to haunt us. And if it's, a very serious issue, maybe years after, it will continue to gnaw at us if we, failed to meet this moral law and to obey this moral law. We also recognize morals without having to be told what they are. This is because God has already told us. In Romans chapter 2, verse 14, it says He's written His law on our hearts. I'll read Romans 2, verses 14 and 15. It says, "For when Gentiles who do not have the law, by nature do the things in the law, these, although not having the law, are a law to themselves, who show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and between themselves their thoughts accusing or else excusing them." That was from Romans 2, 14 and 15. And so God's written His law on our hearts so that we know right from wrong. And we especially recognize moral laws when we are a victim in the circumstance. When someone transgresses a moral law against us, we immediately recognize that, right? We're all probably familiar with the story of Les Miserables, where Jean Valjean steals a loaf of bread for his family, We all are on the side of Jean Valjean. Such a tragedy. He goes to prison and all this terrible stuff. But then if you put yourself on the other side, if he was stealing your loaf of bread, how do you feel about it, right? Immediately go, hey, that was my bread, you stole it, right? Immediately recognize that was a wrong done to me. That should not have been done. Now, we can still have mercy, but we recognize it was a wrong done to us. And so because God made us as moral beings, He's given us morality. He's written that law in our hearts, which whenever there's a law, again, like I said before, there's a lawmaker. And God is the one who wrote that law on our hearts. God is also the one who enforces that law. That's why, as people, we have guilty feelings, don't we? When we know we've done something wrong. That's because we know that we need God's forgiveness because we just did something wrong, right? That's why we have guilty feelings, because we actually are guilty, when we fail to meet the moral laws He's given to us. So that's another line of argument we can share with our friend who's a secular humanist. Another one is, for the existence of God, is the uncaused cause, that God is the uncaused cause. This is referred to, if you find it online, Kalam's cosmological argument, or the Kalam cosmological argument. And Kalam is apparently Arabic for eternal, is what that word means. The argument is very simple, but it's very profound at the same time. Here's the argument stated. It says, everything that had a beginning had a cause. The universe had a beginning, therefore the universe had a cause. The universe is not eternal. Those three steps. And to develop that second piece, the universe had a beginning. Astronomers and scientists generally agree with that the universe had a beginning. There's not an eternal universe. For example, the laws of thermodynamics really tend to show that this has to be the case. The first law of thermodynamics tells us that energy, the amount of energy in the universe, is constant. And the second law of thermodynamics says the amount of usable energy then is decreasing. Right? So you can see the problem. If you only have so much energy and the amount that's usable is decreasing, if the universe exists forever, you'd be out of energy already. We wouldn't have any energy to be keeping things going. And so the universe can't be eternal, or there'd be no energy left in it. And, this can be said in an even more simpler way, that even a child can understand, and that is, we recognize logically that nothing comes from nothing. Right? Nothing comes from nothing. No matter how long you have nothing, you just have nothing. You never get something out of that nothing, right? It's just got to be nothing. And therefore, there must have been something that created the universe. And that is God. God is the one who created the universe. Now, some try and say, well, it wasn't God who created the universe, it was the Big Bang. Right? There's this singular, and the singular exploded, and everything we see is here now because of that explosion. But that doesn't really answer the question. Where did that thing that exploded come from? Right? All you did was move it back a bit. But you still have the same question. Where did singular come from? Well, God would have had to create the singular if he indeed created through a Big Bang. I'm not saying that He did, but if He did, He would still have to create that singular. The next line of argumentation we can share with them for the existence of God is the argument from design, which really follows these others we've been talking about. It's also called the teleological argument. And again, it's a simple argument, but it's profound. And it says, first of all designs imply a designer. Secondly, there is great design in the universe, and therefore there must be a great designer of the universe. Right? It's simple, but it's profound. The implication is that the greater the design, the greater the intelligence required to design it. Right? You think about, I know a number of you are involved with the children's ministry here at the church, and when the room is emptied and the crafts are left in there the kids have been working on, you can always tell the one the teacher's been working on, can't you? It's always really obvious who was the person who had a little more skill there and was working on it. And nothing against the kids. It's great that they're doing what they do and they're developing and all that, but it's obvious, right? I mean, you can tell. Well, how much more so when we look at the universe, when we look at all the creation around us, do we see the hand of a great designer at work here? We can train chimpanzees to do various things. You've seen maybe specialists talking about how they can be trained to learn different things and all of that, but they could never write one of the works of Shakespeare. In 1,000 years. All the chimpanzees together could never do it. It was just beyond their capability. And then when we look at, the human body, for example, or any living body, and we see the complexity that's there within the cells of that living body. And it requires an incredible designer to create that. At the time of Darwin and soon after that, cells in the body were just kind of thought of like as these blobs, like a jelly bean or something. They didn't really realize that when we developed like the electron microscope and all that, we could look inside. It's like, oh, it's got organs. It's got all these little systems in there. It's like this little, factory going on inside that cell. It's not just a blob there. There's actually all this complexity within this tiny little cell here. And then you look at a body, an organism like us as human beings with all the intricate systems that are working in our bodies so that we, can function and all the things that we can do, the circulatory system, the digestive system, the respiratory system, all that. You can see how it required a genius to design all of this. One of the things I always like to point out too to the evolutionists is you have to have the whole system for it to work. If I just have a stomach and no esophagus and no intestines and nothing else, it's not going to work. You got to have it all, right? And that's how God made it. That's how He designed it. And so we see that. We see that this incredible design requires a great designer. Even Carl Sagan, the agnostic astronomer, once said that the brain is a very big place in a very small space. And further, that the neurochemistry of the brain is astonishingly busy. The circuitry of a machine more wonderful than any devised by humans. That was Carl Sagan. Others have said that if the genetic information in the brain were written out in English, it would fill 20 million volumes. That's in our brains. It's incredible. One of the examples I like to give with people when I've talked about these things in the past, doing street evangelism and things like that, is usually you're in a place where there's a building, like we're sitting in a building right now. And I would just say, when we look at a building, we don't look at it and say, wow, what an interesting random combination of brick and glass and wood. Someone just threw all that together and look what came out, No one recognizes that. No one sees that. Everyone goes, wait a minute, that can't be, Even something as simple in comparison to our bodies as a building, someone had to design that. For all the electrical wiring and the bricks and the windows, all to fit just right. There was a designer that did that. And that's a relatively simple structure compared to what God has made. Another evidence for the existence of God that we can point people to, I'm not going to develop this because I've talked about it on previous studies, is the fulfilled prophecies of the Bible. When we look at the prophecies of the Bible, they demonstrate that a being outside of time wrote the Bible to be able to predict, hundreds of years later what's going to happen with amazing accuracy. That's not something a human being can do. And that shows that there's a being who sits outside of time who predicted those things. So now that we've been talking about the existence of God with all these other lines of argument and lines of defense, when we talk about miracles and the fact that the secular humanist wants to deny that miracles can happen, well, if God exists, miracles are not a problem, right? If God created everything, which He did, miracles are just simply no problem for Him. Next, I want to look at this point that the secular humanist has, that science is the only source of truth. And I'd like to point out to my friends who are secular humanists that they forget that science is a discipline of observation. That's what science is. Science cannot make dogmatic statements about truth. Science is a process of discovery. In fact, we often find this, that, what is science today, tomorrow is a joke, right? We've seen that. We look back through history and we look at what was considered science, ages ago. Now, I know there are some flat worlders out there today, so I'm not trying to offend anybody, any flat worlder hears this. But most of us look at that and go, well, I got that one wrong, right? That's not really how it works. And, Aristotle of putting the earth in the center, of the universe and all of that, we know that's not true either, right? We've sent satellites out. We know that the earth is revolving around the sun, all this sort of thing. And so, that's the thing about science. Science isn't intended to stamp out dogmatic truth. It's just people studying and trying to observe and trying to figure things out. I'd also like to point out that this idea that faith and science are at odds with each other for Christianity is not the case. That is not the case, that they are not at odds with each other. In fact, God calls us to reason with Him. From the Old Testament, in Isaiah 1:18, God says there, "Come now and let us reason together, says the Lord. Though your sins are like scarlet, they shall be as white as snow. Though they are red like crimson, they shall be as wool." And so God inviting us to use reason with Him, to talk with Him about these things. And, the disciples in the New Testament, we see them reasoning with people from the Scriptures, persuading them based off of scriptural evidence and historical evidence that Jesus is the Christ. For example, from Acts 17, starting at verse 10, it says, "Then the brethren immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea. When they arrived, they went into the synagogue of the Jews. These were more fair-minded than those of Thessalonica, in that they received the word with all readiness and searched the Scriptures daily to find out whether these things were so. Therefore many of them believed, and also not a few of the Greeks, prominent women as well as men." Now, in this translation, this is New King James I read from today, it says the Bereans were called more fair-minded, or, others may say more noble in your translation, because they weren't just taking what was said by the apostles at, face value. They searched it out and made sure that it was actually true. They looked in their own scriptures to see if the things that they were saying would pan out. Now, if we were invited to have a faith that lacked reason, a faith that is just blind and just believes whatever you hear, this would have been seen negatively, right? Not positively. It wouldn't have been praised that they checked up on these things and make sure they were true. It would have been said, well, these guys were weak in faith. They didn't just believe, like these other guys did. They actually wanted to find the evidence. No, instead it's praised that these guys were wise. They wanted to make sure, are we really believing what's true? Are we figuring out, are we finding out what is really the truth here? Because Christianity is an evidential faith. That's what Christianity is. It's a faith based in evidence. It's not just based on feeling or something like this. You think about the writings of Luke. When Luke wrote the gospel named after him, he says that he talked to eyewitnesses and reported then on what he had discovered about the life of Jesus. And the accuracy of the Gospel of Luke is praised to this day by secular archaeologists. The Gospel of Luke is useful to them when they go to try and find archaeological digs in Israel because it's so accurate. We look at what the apostles write then in the New Testament. And John in particular says that they wrote of what they saw and touched and handled, right? These things really happened that we're writing about. And, the fact that Christianity is an evidential faith is why we have apologetics. Why we look at the evidence that's out there and that supports the Christian faith, because we have a faith that is based in evidence. Faith does not have to be blind. That's the assumption that the secular humanist makes, that if you have any faith, it's blind faith. It doesn't have to be that way. Faith can be based in evidence. And in our faith, we're exhorted to bring, like I said, reason into our faith. Now, many Christians do have sort of blind faith. You'll meet Christians that do have blind faith, but we don't have to, because the facts actually fit with our beliefs, because it's the very truth of God. And so that's exactly what you would expect, that the facts are going to support what God has revealed. And that's, in fact, exactly what happens. And so as Christians, we use good science, established science, to better understand God's creation, just like men like Newton were doing that discovered the science. We use it in the same way. But we reject the bad, unsubstantiated science, things like the theory of evolution that really are not substantiated. And next time we come together, we're going to look more at evolution in particular. So I'll go ahead and close out our study then. I'll open it up for